Guys, this is Pete, aka the Carrot Man, coming at you today with a bit of a sore throat, but hopefully it will hold up for me to deliver a podcast for you guys, an episode on what I'm going to be calling EV tracing. So what the hell is EV tracing and why is it important to you? Let's rephrase this. Tracing EV. Why is it important to trace EV when you think about a poker decision? Well, what's tracing for a start? You know when you're a kid and you get like that, I guess you know what tracing is, right? You get like a picture and you're not like good enough to draw it yourself yet or to copy it, so you just like go over the line with like the see-through paper and you like make your own drawing. It's kind of like a cheating way to draw. Well, when you trace something, you're keeping an eye on the exact format, like the exact structure of that thing that you're tracing. You're not making a replica of it, you are actually just like keeping it detail for detail. So I guess what tracing EV is when you take a poker decision and you actually look at the EV of your choice and you don't lose sight of EV at any point in the decision making process. There are lots of things that you can think when you analyse a poker decision. It's an immensely complicated game with a huge array of different alternatives that can be thought of at any given point in the decision making process. Like, I could ask 5 of my students the same question and they could all give me ridiculously different answers about what to do and why, and that could be because they're not actually tracing EV to the fullest extent possible and they're perhaps losing sight of what factors are actually the most relevant thing to maximising the EV of their decision. Because let's face it, let's start with one universal truth about poker. Whenever you make a choice, you should be trying to make the choice that is the highest EV in the short term or in the long term, depending on how important it actually is to care about long-term EV. So what I'll be talking about in this podcast is both types of EV. Short-term, meaning in a vacuum, how can you maximize your expectation from this hand on average in a vacuum? And long-term, how can you play a strategy that will beat your opponents the most in the long term and exploit them the most, or stop you from being exploited, or be balanced, or whatever it is you're trying to achieve with that long-term strategy. So EV is the same thing. Whether you're dealing with it in one hand or you're dealing with how multiple hands affect it, you're still dealing with expected value, how much money you expect to gain or lose by making a certain play or a certain series of play, if we're talking about long-term EV and strategy. So EV tracing is making sure that you're always thinking about EV in every poker decision that you make, and that you don't end up having a thought process that loses sight of this all-important thing that should always be at the forefront of your mind. So why is this important? Well, EV is money. And if you lose sight of EV, you end up making choices that lead to you making less money on average. And there are just many, many ways in which you can sort of fall off this wagon and actually end up losing sight of EV and not tracing it as well as you should. So how do you make sure that you trace EV in the fullest way and make sure that every decision you make is made because you think it leads to the most plus EV way? Well, you need to actually know which factors are relevant for EV and how they're relevant for EV. So let's take an example. A student might say, I might say, why is this a good c-bet? And the student might say, well, the board is queen 6-2 rainbow, it's really dry. And I might say, okay, so why is that a good c-bet then? And they'll say, because the flop's dry. And I'll say, okay, you've established this, but what is it about this dry flop that actually makes this a good c-bet? Because as of yet, my student hasn't mentioned EV to me at all. They've not said, well, dry flops relate to plus EV c-bets because X, Y, Z. Have a think about that. Why does a dry flop lead to a c-bet making you more money on a dry flop than it would on a wet one when that c-bet is a bluff? Just think about that for a minute. Pause the podcast, whatever. Get an answer. So the reason is that on a dry board texture, there are less ways in which that flop can connect with the range of hands your opponent calls your open with pre-flop. And that means that your opponent's range is generally just weaker on a dry texture and it contains a higher percentage of air. Air is very abundant in your opponent's range on a board like queen 6-2 rainbow because the only hands that can connect in a way that can continue their readily out of position especially would be hands like queen X, the odd 6X, but let's face it, people aren't playing too much 6X, and 2X, which is even less likely. Then there are pocket pairs which maybe you can call one street or whatever, but are not going to be able to continue for too long, and there are no draws that add extra continuation there. There's basically nothing, so your opponent is just going to have way more air than usual. How is that? How do we trace EV here? Well, we say that because your opponent has more air than usual, they fold more of the time, and the higher amount of the time they fold, the more plus EV your c-bet is, because the higher amount of time you pick up the pot and the bigger the percentage of that pot goes into your stack via the route of fold equity caused by your c-bet bluff and that dry texture. So that is a very detailed explanation of a seemingly simple spot as to how EV is traced throughout the decision-making process. there are many ways I could have gone wrong there when I gave that description. I could have said, well, this c-bet is good because the board's dry, and then I could have explained that by saying, because if he doesn't have a queen, he'll fold, or something like that, which is not necessarily true, and it's just not that relevant to EV. You've not explained the full picture that your opponent will fold more frequently, like just nailing what is actually essential to EV. Let's take another example. Let's say that a student makes a bet where they just bluff on the turn. Like they c-bet the flop with like pocket nines on 8-6-4, and then the turn's a king, and they bet the pocket nines on the turn again, like heads up. And I'll say, like, why did you bet the turn there? And you've probably heard, if you've a regular listener to my podcast, you know that I'm quite big on the 3 reasons to bet, and anything else that falls out with those reasons not being a satisfactory condition to make a bet. And they might say to me, because it's a good barrel card. And I'll say, okay, right, so what makes it a good barrel card? And I'll say it's a scary card, it's a big card. And you can see here that what I'm trying to do is lead them towards tracing EV, because right now they're not tracing EV. They've removed the EV stencil and they're just like copying some weird replica that's not actually EV, because right now they're telling me it's a good barrel card, and that's because it scares their opponent's range. But what hands does it scare? It scares worse hands. Like they're not, if they have a king, they're not going to fold it. If they have like pocket tens or pocket jacks or pocket queens, the chances are they're not going to fold this hand just because a king came on the turn right now. So when you make this turn barrel with pocket nines, what you need to understand is that the hands you're making your opponent fold are worse hands. They're hands that you beat at showdown anyway, and that lends itself to checking back. Let's also take into effect that these worse hands are things like 8x on the flop, pocket sevens, hands that are not going to improve that often on the river. They have maybe 5 outs at most against your pocket nine, so there's no need to bet for value or protection or as a bluff. The reasons to bet are not there, and that's because they are not conducive to the highest EV. What happens when you bet that turn with pocket nines is that money goes into the pot, mainly when you're behind, maybe sometimes for thin value when you're ahead, but that's not value that you can get on most river cards when they check to you anyway. And basically, by saying that's a good barrel card, end of thought process, I stop, you've stopped tracing EV, and therefore you've made a lower EV decision. It's higher EV to check that turn because your hand is not gaining anything by betting. Not really, it's gaining a little bit of protection from like the times pocket sevens rivers you but folds the turn, and that's about it. It's not really gaining any value because when your opponent continues, they'll be a favourite against your range. It's not gaining any fold equity that you need, because the only fold equity you're getting is that against worse hands that you're going to beat at showdown anyway. And so there's no EV gain there. You can gain EV when you win the pot more often, right? So either increasing the amount of the time that you win the pot, or you can improve EV by increasing the amount of money that you win in that pot, or both, right? So that's how EV is a function of how often and how much you win, how often you win the pot and how much you win when you win it. And when you bet the turn, you don't improve either of these two things, and you've lost the trace of EV there. You're sort of off the trail. You're thinking about things that are not relevant. So there's lots of ways in which you can go wrong when you don't trace EV properly. Let's take a third and final example of the ways in which you can go wrong here. Let's say people say things like, oh, this is a good 3-bet bluff hand, right? When their understanding of the 3-bet game is not like quite complete yet, it's at still quite a beginner level. They'll say, okay, ace-4 suited is a good 3-bet bluff hand. And they'll just do it. And their opponent could be like a reg who just isn't folding to 3-bets, like cutoff versus, let's say it's button versus small blind. Button open sees a reg who's like really aggressive, 4-bets a lot, and doesn't fold to 3-bets very often. And hero takes ace-4 of clubs, 3-bets in the small blind, and I'll say, why did you do that? And he'll say, it's a good 4-bet bluff hand. And I'll say, why is it a good 4-bet bluff hand? And I'll say, blocker. Cool, it has a blocker. I don't mean to like suggest that my students are like these monosyllable, mono-word spouting idiots or anything. I'm kind of like framing this in a way that's like, why did you do this? Blocker, like one word. No, that's not what I mean. But you get the point. They're like, give me one reason at a time, right? This is the way the more infantile like poker thought process before it's been nourished and developed like tends to think. It thinks in like terms of like one reason at a time or 2 reasons at a time without tracing EV and putting the full story together. That's what I'm getting at here. So when they say it's good because it has good blockers, that's not actually a reason. Why? Because it's not tracing EV. That's still not plus EV to 3-bet bluff because you don't want a bluff in range at all. Why you don't want a bluff in range at all? Because villain is not folding to enough of your 3-bets. You need to have a linear range, and your linear range probably needs to be tighter and containing more hands that dominate him and flop better frequently against his range. You're not trying to maximize fold equity pre-flop because you don't have enough to make a 3-bet bluff. You don't have enough to make a 3-bet, which the primary purpose of which is for pre-flop fold equity. It's not sufficient for you to do that. So the fact that your hand has a blocker and is suited That would help if it was a good idea in the first place to 3-bet bluff, but because it's not, because villain's continuing so often to your 3-bets, that is not justifying it. But why did you make that error and think that was a reason? Because you didn't trace EV properly, and you didn't realise that a 3-bet with a hand like ace-4 suited is only plus EV if you have enough fold equity, either pre-flop, post-flop, or the combination of both, to make that good. And having a blocker or having a playable suited hand with an ace in it only adds to that reasoning, to that merit in the first place. It's not the foundational reason in and of itself to 3-bet. And that's because if you're putting in 9-10 big blinds without fold equity, then you're necessarily losing EV because you're building a pot that you can't win often enough. Remember, EV is about how often you win the pot and how much you win. So if you're actually losing that pot most of the time because you're against a really stationary player who's just going to give you hell in position, you need a stronger range to 3-bet for value, right? You can't be bloating a pot with ace-4 suited out of position. If they're just going to flat you all day and not fold to you on the flop, then you're losing EV because you're A, putting in a lot of money into the pot more than you need to, and B, you're not winning that pot very often, so the majority of that money you put in is actually going into your opponent's stack and not your stack. There may be some implied odds from this, like the less fold equity you have, the better it is for you when you actually hit the flop and that kind of thing, but generally speaking, it's not going to compensate for the amount of times you just have to give up post-flop or whatever. So if you're 3-bet bluffing, remember, trace EV, you're doing it for fold equity, and if you don't have sufficient fold equity, then no reason that loses the trace of EV, such as this is a good hand for it, is going to justify that. You need to use that in conjunction with the trace of EV and not just on its own. That's what tracing EV is all about. It's about not forgetting what makes the play, what brings money to you by virtue of you making that play. That's the key thing. What is it about a play that actually causes you to win the pot more often or win more money from the pot? Or maybe in some situations lose less than you would by folding. Like for instance, you're in the big blind, you have like king-4 suited and your opponent opens the button. For min, you're getting great pot odds here. In this case, it's not the case that you think you're going to win this pot super often by calling. It's not the case that you think you're going to win huge pots with king-4 suited. The implied odds of the hand are not that great. But you know that for the price, your implied odds are okay, and your pot odds are certainly really good because you're getting like 3.5 to 1 right off the bat. You're just calling a min open, and it's better than folding, and that is a very central reason to EV. Why is it central? Well, because if you fold, you lose 1 big blind in EV. That's what your poker tracker hold'em manager software will tell you. At the end of that hand, it'll be minus 1 big blind. You folded. You lost the big blind, sorry. But if you call there, maybe it's only minus 74, 0.74 of a big blind instead, and therefore you've improved EV. So calling is better than folding due to pot odds. That is a reason that traces EV. To fold king-4 there by saying, well, it's a hand that's dominated a lot. This is true, but that's not tracing EV. You've lost the most important factors there. The most important factor there is not how often the hand is dominated. That's just a side consideration that might come into play if it was close. The most important factor is, literally, do pot odds make calling better than folding? In this case, yes, they do. You win the pot sometimes in improved. Unimproved, you can, I don't know, flop equity, make the best hand often enough that for that price, calling's better than folding. You need to trace EV, you need to think about what is the most relevant thing to EV. Right, let me give you a few more examples of times when people, really common times, where people fail to trace EV, and that's a big problem because it leads to them actually making a significantly worse decision. So here's one. I'm on the flop against the fish and I reason as follows. I'm going to bet here to represent hands like ace-queen and king-queen on this queen-10, 9 flop, or whatever. I have all those range. I'm going to represent an overpair because they're in my range and they're not in his range. This doesn't trace EV, this reason. Why not? Well, because what makes it, let's say we're c-betting with air here, by the way, like we don't have much equity, we have like a gut shot or something. But what makes a c-bet with a gut shot plus EV is having fold equity, right? We're clearly not trying to build a pot with like low equity in the hand to win at showdown. So when we make a light c-bet, it's having fold equity. So it doesn't matter if we can rep pocket aces and the fish doesn't have those in his range. That doesn't matter one bit if the fish is just hitting this flop really often in some way that is going to cause him to either raise us or call us. And this is true because on queen 10, 9 two-tone, 2 of 1 suit, the fish is just connecting with this flop in such a way that we can't do anything about that. And just because we can rep a strong hand is not a reason to c-bet. You're not tracing EV there. To trace EV, you need to say, how's my fold equity? Does it work often enough when I c-bet 2/3 pot that c-bet does better than breaking even in a vacuum? And to do that, you would need to divide the amount you're risking into your risk plus your potential gain if your bet succeeds. So say pot's 15, you bet 10, then you're dividing 10 into 25. Your c-bet needs to work 40% of the time. to break even. You have some equity, so okay, it's a bit less, 30-35% of the time. Is it working that often? No, the guy's folding only like 25% to C-bets anyway, and this is a super wet board. You should check. You need to trace EV. Saying something like, well, he'll think that I have an overpair, or I can rep pocket queens, or I would play aces the same way. This is a reason that could be thought up by a human mind, and it could be taken by a human mind as a reason to do something, but it's not an EV tracing reason, and therefore it's going to lead you to make mistakes. People make mistakes in poker when they make choices through reasons that haven't traced EV. That's why it happens, right? Whenever you do something that costs you a lot of money, it's because you have lost the scent of EV. You've lost an understanding of what factors make that relevant, make your choice relevant to EV. So when you call the river, when you know you should probably fold, the reason that you've made a mistake there is that you've lost sight of EV. EV told you, if you traced EV properly, it would tell you that the relevant factors you need to keep your grip on here are basically how often your opponent is bluffing and how much equity you need to call to bluff catch, your bluff catcher on the river. If you'd analysed those properly and kept that trace, you'd probably have made the right plus EV choice, or the most plus EV choice. Whereas if you just said something like, well, maybe he thinks that I think he's got the draw and then he's going to do this, or whatever reason, I don't know, or he's just trying to bluff me off because he thinks that I've got a weak hand or something like that, you've lost the trace of EV. You're just kind of like straying away from it, and you need to think about, how much equity do I need? How much do I have? How is my opponent's range narrowed given his actions in this hand so far? And what can I do what does that mean I should do? Does that mean I meet my target equity, or does it mean I fall short of my target equity? Like, what is the case here? Also, you could have one really, really common thing, and I'm going to finish up with this one. I'm sorry it's going to be a shorter podcast today, guys, but my voice is not holding up so great, as you can probably hear. My throat's a bit sore, so I'm going to wrap it up and do a longer one for you guys next week. But what is a very common spot in which people deliberately stop tracing EV? It's when they don't want to make a difficult decision on a later street. Here's an example. Villain bets flop. And we have like Jack 9, we called out the big blind, called the cutoff open with Jack 9 suited, and flop is like Jack 10-3. Villain bets, CC bets. Newer players, players who are less experienced and are not so skilled in tracing EV, will actually decide to raise this flop sometimes for informational purposes to make their decisions easier for the rest of the hand. They might reason as follows: well, if I call, I don't know anything extra about Villain's range other than he bet the flop, and therefore maybe I'll be in a horrible spot on the turn where I don't know what to do. And this is true. You might not know whether you should be calling down 1 street, 2 streets, or 3 streets against this one villain. You might not know that. That's true. I'll give you that. But if you raise, what's happening is that you're inflating the pot mostly when you're behind, and you're putting extra money into the pot, but you're actually saying to Villain, I'll give you a chance to fold when you don't have showdown value. And that's allowing him to not bluff. Whereas if you call flop, call turn, at least you've put money into the pot on the turn against his whole range, and you've allowed him to put money into the pot with weaker hands rather than tightening his range like intentionally just to give yourself an easier decision on the turn. Like, okay, so you raised the flop, you expended the same amount of money as you would by calling a turn bet, only you got money into the pot only when you're behind, or mostly when you're behind, or something like that. So thoughts like, I'm going to bet this turn just so I don't have to face a bet on the river, or I'm going to raise this flop so I don't have to face a bet on the turn, or I'm going to just bet this turn for information. This kind of thing is not tracing EV usually, and that's why informational raising and stuff is not part of the 3 reasons to bet. If you want to trace EV, you're going to have to keep your eye on what actually makes putting money into the pot plus EV minus EV, or what determines the degree to which it's plus or minus EV to put money into the pot. And what determines that degree of how plus EV something is how much equity, like I say, you have in the hand, how often you win the pot, and how much you win when you win the pot. So that's why you need to keep your focus there and not just do things to make life easier in the future. Just because you've created a spot that's tricky, or a spot that's tricky has fallen upon you, which it always will in poker, doesn't mean that you've not made the most plus EV choice up until now. Because you got into a difficult spot that you didn't know what to do, doesn't mean that you made a mistake on an earlier street. Because poker is not about avoiding difficult situations, it's about, guess what, EV. And that's why it's important to maximize EV by tracing EV and know which factors are logical to consider in any poker decision, and not fall into the trap of having thoughts that are removed from EV. Right, I'm going to have to go rest my voice. I hope you enjoyed that little segment. I hope you take that on board and maybe catch yourself. If you find yourselves making a choice that wasn't central to EV, maybe a little red flag will pop up in your head now and you'll realize, okay, maybe I should have, done something else instead or whatnot. So have a think about that, and hopefully that helps. If you want to hear more from me, you can check out my website, my videos on grinderskill.com, or shoot me an email if you're interested in private coaching to admin@carrotcorner.com. Carrotcorner.com is my site where you can find all info about my packaging, pricing, and just poker articles and stuff like that. So hope you're enjoying the podcast, guys. Please leave me feedback, get in touch, let me know what else you want to see on the Carrot Poker podcast, or if you even want to appear on it, send me an email and we can discuss that as well. Should be fun. So until then, I will wish you good luck at the tables, and yeah, see you next time.
Sliver girl, sexual